welcome to the Transforming Trauma Podcast, a complex trauma podcast through the NARM Training Institute. My name is Sarah Bueno, and I'm so excited to be sharing today's interview with you. Hey, Transforming Trauma listeners. Please join us starting in June for our online NARM training in learning how to transform trauma. This online NARM basics training is available for professionals working with clients or populations dealing with complex trauma. Now more than ever before, it's essential that we learn how to resolve complex trauma and support post-traumatic growth. NARM provides a relational approach to addressing the current COVID pandemic and tools to support healing in the aftermath of this collective trauma. If you're looking for more advanced training in complex trauma and are working in mental health, healthcare, education, substance abuse recovery, or allied fields, join us for this Level 1 NARM training to become a NARM-informed professional. For more information and to apply, please visit at www.narmtraining.com/online-basics. Today's episode is something that's really special to me. Spirituality is a topic that I am personally really interested in, and it's one of the reasons that I was drawn to the NARM training, as I was told that there's a spiritual underpinning to the work. And so I was really excited to talk to Dr. Heller more about his view of spirituality and how he kind of sees it as a current running through NARM. So Dr. Laurence Heller is the founder of the NeuroAffective Relational Model, which is NARM, a specialized psychobiological approach to working with developmental trauma, as you've well heard. This model is presented in his best-selling book, Healing Developmental Trauma: How Early Trauma Affects Self-Regulation, Self-Image, and the Capacity for Relationships. And it's currently published in more than 10 languages. Larry actually speaks several languages and for the past 20 years has been conducting seminars in the NARM approach throughout the United States and Europe. And there are currently 7 teachers, including himself, around the globe. Larry has also been one of the faculty of several major universities and taught courses and seminars at medical schools, hospitals, and pain clinics in the U.S. and Europe. He co-founded the Gestalt Institute of Denver and later the Rocky Mountain Psychotherapy Institute, where he trained hundreds of mental health professionals. In the past 25 years, he's provided thousands of case consultations for therapists in both the U.S. and in Europe. I really, really hope you enjoyed this conversation between myself and Larry all about spirituality. Hello, Dr. Heller. Welcome to Transforming Trauma.
Hi, Sarah. Glad to be here.
Yeah, we're really excited to speak with the founder of NARM. We've introduced you a little bit, but I'd love to give you an opportunity to tell folks really more about yourself.
Well, I was a psychotherapist in private practice for 35 years, but I've also been teaching for the last 25. I'm no longer in private practice. I just teach and write. I've really explored and experimented with many different psychological systems, many different bodywork systems. I've made a significant kind of commitment to spiritual work, a couple of different traditions. I'm not identified with any particular tradition at this point, but the spiritual piece was also an important part of my personal work and what I've incorporated into NARM.
And that's exactly what we're going to dig into today. So what is your view of what spirituality actually means? What is it?
Well, that's a really big question. And
I know, right?
People have been talking about it for thousands of years. But,
right.
Very simply, I think it's an experience and not just an understanding. I was going to say understanding, but it's a direct experience that there's something more to us than the surface of things, that there's a deep emotional level, and even beyond that, there's a deeper level that I think many people call spirituality, of being, we can call it, various kinds of things. Different systems use different words, and I try to avoid putting names on things because I think it tends to distract us rather than open us to new possibilities. So very briefly, it's just that there's something more to all of us, and there's particularly something more to us than what we take to be our personal identity. And that understanding informs the work that I do and the work that I teach.
Yeah. Well, before we get there, do you want to talk about your views and how spirituality is connected or impacted by trauma?
when we're talking about trauma, I put into two different, major categories. One is shock trauma and one is developmental trauma. And it's important to understand the difference in working with those. But either shock trauma or developmental trauma can, of course, have a profound impact on who we take ourselves to be.
Yeah.
And to answer your question, Sarah, is that it's the more developmental trauma that we've experienced. And remember, developmental trauma is coming into the world with no expectations. And the early world that we experience is our absolute and total reality. And our parents are gods in our mind, in a child's mind. That's they seem magical to a child. And so when we have a lot of or enough or significant developmental trauma, one of the major ways that I talk about in NARM that people manage is by disconnecting.
Yeah.
And we disconnect from our bodies, we disconnect from other people, but we lose connection with the deeper foundation of who we are. And so it's an emotional disconnection, it's a psychological disconnection, but it also developmental trauma and whenever shock trauma, we manage it by disconnecting from what's most real and most alive in us.
I guess I'm curious too about, and I don't know that this has an answer, but something to ponder is what makes someone know that there's this disconnection, right? Because I consider myself a seeker of spirituality. You've said that you were as well. And so what is it that you think draws people to seek that when they have been disconnected from it due to developmental trauma?
Ultimately, and part of my deeper spiritual approach is that we can never truly be disconnected from the source, but with the awareness of the connection can be lost as we adapt to various kinds of trauma by disconnecting. It's one of the major ways, as I mentioned, that people manage trauma. So, I guess it's simply that this profound disconnection and the various reflections of that will continue in that path for the rest of our life. And going to your question of why some people and not other people, I think it's often because either they've stayed more in connection, never fully lost that connection to the source, so they pick it up, or sometimes people have what are called peak experiences, both P-E-K and P-E-A-K.
Yeah.
In the sense that there's something where they get a direct experience that there's something more to us. And that then touches our heart in such a profound way. And then we start to follow, really our heart's desire, because the heart is never fully disconnected from the source, or we wouldn't continue existing. So it's the recognition of the connection happens for some people, or the disconnection. And both of those can then drive or at least motivate people to work on themselves, both psychologically and spiritually.
I'm curious if you'd be willing to share what that was for you that led you to really seek spirituality and reconnect with your heart's desire.
It's an interesting question and it's personal and I'm fine to answer. It's not a question that's ever been asked of me in an interview. So it's
ooh.
But, it's like before I ever did spiritual work, I had many really different experiences of what people would call a certain kind of spirituality. Now, I was, let's say, not really happy with the little religious stuff that I was exposed to, but there was a sense that there was something more. And then I would have these peak experiences. And of course, if you're mechanistically oriented, people will just reduce this to endorphins or certain neurochemicals. But for example, one of the things that I've done my whole life I love to do is long distance running. And I had some experiences when I was running long distance of this kind of connection and this sense that beyond the busyness of the mind, that everything was perfect. So that was one piece. That was earlier. Then a little bit later, I was running the Gestalt Institute of Denver at the time, and one of the people on the staff said, well, there's this person that you might want to explore, because I was, exploring all kinds of energetic and body work and psychological work. He was doing what he called fourth chakra work.
Ooh, okay,
Yeah.
okay. Now you're speaking my language.
And he was using deep breathing to open that particular center. And at that point, I would have still probably identified myself as at very least an agnostic and maybe even an atheist. I don't think I ever called myself an atheist, but would have probably identified as an agnostic. So I wasn't going in expecting anything in particular. I just was curious, and that was part of the general exploration that I was doing. So he started doing this breath work, and really relatively quickly, maybe 10 minutes of breath work, it's like for me, the whole universe opened up. And I experienced myself as part of this web of energy that was boundless. And I was just one little point on this boundless net of energy. And I had the direct experience that every molecule of who we are, every molecule of the universe really, is love. And so that ultimately, that experience then led to some significant, 14 or 15 years of a couple different traditions, as I mentioned, but serious spiritual work, which then some of which I thought was really helpful and other parts of which I didn't think were so useful. In particularly the psychological work that they thought they were doing, I wasn't so fond of. But at the same time, that continued my journey and continued to help me connect to something that's much deeper than my individual self, and that, again, we might call presence or being or essence or, various words that people use for it. I was ready for that, like that fourth chakra work. I'd had more experiences than I want to take time for on this broadcast to mention the things that led in that direction. And then the fourth chakra work opened up this other whole different dimension. I was no longer an atheist or an agnostic after that. And that then led to some of the many years of spiritual work that I did.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It's interesting as you describe. I mean, I don't have personal experience with psychedelics, but I hear that that's what the experience of doing psychedelics is like, is then transcending the ego and being able to recognize the interconnectedness. And I've also heard that breath work can do what psychedelics does. So that just sounds like a wonderfully transcendent experience.
Well, it truly was. And I've not done psychedelics. And again, I think for some people they could be dangerous. But I do know people who have, using psychedelics, have made a deeper connection with themselves or with a larger self, or again, whatever word we want to use for it. And it's changed their lives. So when it comes to psychedelics, let's just say I'm agnostic.
Right. So to kind of weave back to the questions, can you talk a little bit about the role of spirituality from a NARM perspective when we're talking about healing trauma?
Well, one of the things, as I mentioned earlier, but it's worth repeating, is that in adapting to early developmental trauma of whatever kind, one of the adaptations that every child makes, and it's a survival mechanism, is that they make themselves wrong for what they experience. A child cannot experience themselves as a good person in a bad situation. So the foundations of our identity end up being shame-based, which the shame is about the experience that we have and has nothing to do with who we are. But as a child, of course, and we could, unless we do some kind of work usually, we don't know that all of that sense of shame and badness that we carry around in so many different forms, somatically, emotionally, psychologically, has really nothing to do with us, has everything to do with the early environmental failure that we experienced, that we have taken on in various ways.
Right. So then when we think about how then spirituality can be used to heal that trauma, what do you say in that regard?
One of the things that I think when a therapist has a real spiritual connection is that our clients pick up our states. And we, as we pick up our clients' states, there's a two-way street that's going on. But they also, it's certainly understood that they borrow the regulation of the therapist. And if that regulation has a spiritual foundation, when people are aware of the spiritual connection, they feel safer on one hand, which means they effort less which means they can be more present, which means that they can be curious rather than problem solving. And as you know, Sarah, because you've done the training, is those are the foundations of what I'm teaching and what Brad is teaching now in NARM.
Right.
And so it's built in to the model. Although, again, I don't push any kind of spiritual dynamic. It's there informing. And those therapists, as going to your question, that experience that have greater resources to bring to the therapeutic process.
And that's just making me think about, obviously, some folks that we work with, and some of us too have had our own spiritual wounding or even spiritual trauma. And so I'm curious what you've seen in terms of that, whether it be a therapist going through this NARM training and how they might react to the spiritual underpinnings, or if you've worked with clients who go through spiritual trauma and what that then looks like in the room.
In Europe, I used to do a 4-day series, two-day workshops. One was called Trauma and Spirituality, and the other was called Spiritual Trauma. And so when you say spiritual trauma, that could mean a lot of different things, as I came to experience, because there were many things that people worked on that I would not have anticipated. So for example, if you're by spiritual trauma, if you mean, well, maybe rather than me guessing, why don't you tell me what you mean by spiritual trauma?
I can just share my own experience. I was raised in the church, and my mom described herself as being best friends with Jesus. And I found that the ways of Jesus were essentially used as a weapon, that we were expected to align with what Jesus's teachings were. And when we were out of alignment with that, we were bad. And that felt like using someone who had nothing but love and positive intentions for people, using it to hurt people. And I obviously realized my mom was doing the best she could, and this was her own wounding that informed all of this. But that's something that I struggled with until after she passed away, and then felt I could reconnect with spirituality on my own terms.
It's interesting how you describe that. And I would agree that is a kind of spiritual trauma, that people experience. And the sad thing is then, in order to protect yourself from the imposition of all these rules and judgments, I'm not just talking to you, I'm saying you in the generic sense, but in order to protect yourself, you have to disconnect from any sense of that deeper reality, which religion at its best points at or tries to point at.
Right.
And so that it is a deep spiritual wounding. And there are, of course, there are many others of different things. Of course, if you've been molested by a priest, for example, because it's a potentially spiritual connection, and sometimes even spirituality is used in the seduction or the grooming of that creates a deep spiritual wound, and people respond to that wound by disconnecting again from the deepest aspects of themselves, when it was really just a failure of the environment, a specific kind of failure, but still it had nothing to do with them. And yet we all pay the price for that disconnection, because we feel that life is meaningless, we feel disconnected. Energy, depression, all these kinds of symptoms that people have really are coming from the loss of a deep connection with the smaller self and the bigger self.
Right. And then that's also making me think of the flip side, where folks can be essentially addicted to spirituality and engage in spiritual bypass rather than that deep, true connection that I hear you talking about.
Oh, I've seen that so often, and I make it because I have a lot of seekers. I don't know what percentage, but a fair amount of spiritual seekers who also come to my trainings, and partly because maybe some element of the spirituality comes through. And I do mention in the book that I draw from Eastern traditions and so on. But what I've seen is that just exactly what you mentioned, this spiritual bypass dynamic, is that many people with the earliest kinds of trauma, which in NARM we call the connection survival style, often when the trauma is so early, they've never embodied. And sometimes, so they often, some people live in their heads, they're more the data-driven types. And then there are people who live in the energetic field that they're so, in order to survive, they've had to disconnect so profoundly from the body, emotions, so they're literally living in the energetic field, which for many of these individuals gives them a certain kind of entry or connection to deeper and sometimes very real states. But the challenge is that they can then use this deeper connection, whether it's real or imaginary, in order to, just as you mentioned, to do this spiritual bypass. So some people never do the work that they need to do to heal those wounds, for example, and just go to the deeper reality, which may have many elements of truth to it, and it still can be a bypass.
And an example that I'm thinking of is forgiveness. I think that the expectation from many spiritual communities is that if you are to use your spiritual tools, that means you will end up at forgiveness. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about NARM not being outcome driven, because if we go in as a therapist hoping to get our client to the space of forgiveness, we're missing the potential grief and anger that a client needs to experience before forgiveness. Essentially, I mean, I think when it's organic and it arises out of the work that a client does, that's essentially the hope I want to hold for people, rather than forgiveness being the goal. And that's just a bypass, right?
Totally. And you've said, use some of the same languaging that I've used about this dynamic, because I think it can
I'm
be
learning.
Really...
Oh, good.
But no, I think this thing I've sometimes talked about, for example, I had a client who was raped. She went to her spiritual teacher, or whoever the person was, and the person said, "Have you forgiven him yet?" And this was like one day after.
And
oh
my God, no.
You couldn't be more misattuned, but this is not so unusual. And I agree completely that it is a wonderful thing when forgiveness organically emerges. It means for me that the heart that had been so wounded is really opening up, because when the heart opens up, we experience forgiveness and gratitude and coming home and compassion and all of these different kinds of things. But it has to do it organically, because just as you were saying, Sarah, when you try to impose it top down, people just end up feeling guilty because they can't forgive, like whoever their pastor is telling them should be forgiving. And it just creates really its own kinds of problematical dynamics.
Right. I'd love to shift into talking a little bit about agency in terms of spirituality and higher power, maybe more specifically. For folks who don't know, the Inner Circle is a place where you can basically get some deeper information about NARM and continue to learn more. And you and Brad just recently did a webinar on agency that was great. And I'm going to pick on Brad for a second because he can take it. One of the things that I heard him say in there was when people turn over their agency to their higher power and they say, oh, it was God's will, or, the universe has got my back, or something like that, that's actually giving over agency. And I'd love to tease out the nuance of how believing in a higher power can be supportive and connective, and how then we can use that as giving up our agency.
Well, I believe what Brad meant, and certainly what I can clarify here, is that when that's a mental process for people, then it's part of that same spiritual bypass that we were talking about.
Yeah.
That it's different when people have a direct experience of something greater, and that becomes then a resource for them. So it's like anything. It's like forgiveness. It's a great thing when it's real and when it's authentic, and it's actually becomes another obstacle when it's forced or effortful or just mental, cognitive, and for many people, their religion is primarily cognitive. It's more about ideas, judgments and all of that, and not, certainly there are many people, I don't want to put everybody in the same, but I see that too much as opposed to some real direct experience of something much bigger than who we are.
Well, and also I can relate that to people's understanding of the 12 steps. And Brad and I have talked about this. We did a little YouTube video on this if people want to check it out, because I feel like the 12 steps get off bad rap very often, as well as Christianity, plenty of other religions. And the way that I view it is it's not necessarily the tenets of any given organization that are bad. It's really the actors and the people who are essentially acting out what they believe are the tenets of any given organized spiritual belief system, right? Because then that's when you're talking about it becomes cognitive. It becomes about the rules and the regulations rather than about this heart-centered connection.
Well, I would take a little bit of exception. I would generally agree with what you're saying, but I do think that some of the tenets, particularly in some traditions, are in themselves harmful
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
passed on.
Yeah.
And then, of
It's
course,
true.
there are many people who, as they communicate the tenets,
Yes.
their own stuff comes through and it gets distorted.
Right.
But I think both can be true.
Yes. Yes. And I'll go with that. I want to take a pause here in the episode because we originally recorded this conversation before the coronavirus hit. In light of the current events, Larry wanted to take this opportunity to directly discuss the spiritual principles underpinning the NARM framework to provide some helpful context for what we're observing, experiencing, and feeling right now through this pandemic. We're sharing it here because it directly ties into the conversation around agency, spiritual bypassing, and meaning making. So, Larry, thanks for being here. I wanted to take some time to connect NARM and spirituality to what's happening right now in the world in terms of COVID and coronavirus. So, one of the thoughts that we just talked about a little bit before we came on is the idea of meaning making in terms of spirituality and how that might be helpful or harmful to people.
Yeah, I mean, obviously we can go to meaning making, but there's the danger of a certain kind of spiritual bypass if depending on what we do with that. I think that, at least from my orientation, is that some kind of spiritual sense, some kind of sense that there's something more than just this, what we see in the physical body that adapts to us, helps us deal with a profound uncertainty of these times, for example. Just some kind of sense of, that, we can't always understand or figure out what's going on or make sense of it. I mean, on one level, the suffering in the world, it makes no sense. It's like we can look around, and some people use that as a way of disconnecting from any kind of spiritual connection, like feeling like, any God that would allow this couldn't be a loving God. So I'm careful not to go too much into meaning, but there is the sense, there's a word that's used in some traditions, just talking about abiding, like we abide, like it gives us the capacity to abide in the sense that we don't know, we don't fully understand. What I see spirituality is giving us the possibility of not knowing cognitively what's going on, because nobody does. Even the scientists, they're doing their best, but they don't know everything about this. We don't know what the future is bringing. In a sense, it's the human condition, but in 3 or 4 times, or maybe more than that, over, in the sense that it brings all of these issues of mortality and what's this all about and what's my place and all this. It brings it to the fore for people.
Yeah.
And so I think real spirituality, not just something like constructs or a spiritual bypass that people do that tends to be more cognitive, just gives us additional resources to tolerate uncertainty, to be in the moment, and so that when there is a real threat out there, but many people who are watching this are not necessarily in real threat, and that helps us to distinguish between our subjective response to the COVID virus, where there's real danger, versus what is subjective, having to do with old survival mechanisms and so on. So it just, I think it just deepens our capacity in that way.
Yeah. I love that term abiding. And it's really helpful because I was trying to teach some folks about radical acceptance the other day. And I think acceptance, at least one participant in this group was saying, like, acceptance to me means that I have to think that something is okay, but abiding has a flavor of like there's passing waves, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly right. That there's, this, as it says, I believe in the Bible, it says, this too shall pass, because it will.
Right. Yeah.
100 and some years ago, we had the Spanish flu, and huge percentages of people died. And in time, that too passed. And then the Roaring 20s, and there was, so we don't know really what the future is going to bring. And this abiding is just being able to be with the not knowing, to be with the uncertainty, to be with the full range of emotions that we have, including anxiety and fears. And that's natural, but it also helps us it gives us a platform where we can see when we might be overreacting, in the sense that it's not just an objective response to the world, the real threat, but what we're bringing forward to it. And that relates, of course, to the issue of agency as we talk about it in NARM.
Right.
So.
Right. And the fear and anxiety leads to my next question, which is about conspiracy theory. And I think that has a lot to do with spirituality and how we're relating to this larger sense of the world. So do you have any thoughts on what that's all about? How people are coming to that?
Well, one of the things that I talked about in the book, the Healing Developmental Trauma book, is that we as human beings tend to prefer identifiable threats that, as opposed to threats that are vaguer, where we can't see the virus, we don't know where it's coming from, we can't always know who's infected. So there's a lot of anxiety, and for many people then to project that anxiety on a particular group, whatever that whatever group is their preference, gives them some kind of feeling, okay, and then they can mobilize their anger because I know that this group, whatever it is doing this and is behind this. So, that kind of response, I think, it's a misguided way, of course, to try and manage anxiety. And so that's, in brief, at least, how I see that dynamic.
Yeah. And like you alluded to earlier, right now, in a time of global crisis, a lot of our trauma is coming to the surface, and our survival styles are showing up in a way that might not be showing up in the day to day. And I'm certainly noticing it on Facebook. I'm noticing it with clients that I have, that these mechanisms, that it's just so interesting how when we're not under stress, we can potentially get by and function at a really, for a lack of a better term, functional level. And then as soon as we're under stress, these survival styles just come right to the forefront.
Yeah, it's really an old psychological axiom that under stress we tend to regress to more basic, sometimes called primitive, protective mechanisms. And I think that certainly does happen when, in this case of a pandemic.
Yeah. I'm so grateful to Larry for providing that contextual reframe for how we can reclaim our agency even in a time of uncertainty. And now let's return to our original conversation. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on post-traumatic growth and the ways that people can make meaning out of traumatic experiences as they move through healing.
Well, I can talk about it most clearly from an NARM perspective. Other modalities and other systems. It's hard, I don't want to presume to talk about them, but what I've seen in NARM, what many people have communicated to me, what people even experience in the groups in various ways, is that as they've done their, working on their developmental issues, because since NARM we're holding that a big part of what we take to be our identity is really a fiction, and that trauma can expose the cracks. It's like they're always there, because any kind of identity that's based on images, which is classically the way certain psychodynamic traditions held us, that we were just self and object images, which they never ask the question, who is it that's holding these images? And that for me is the deeper question. So the experiencing trauma exposes the cracks, because the cracks are always there. And for those people who are motivated and interested, it can open the door to exploring, dimensions that they were unfamiliar with previously. So it is a spiritual doorway for many people, and used that way, whether they ultimately identify it as, use that word or not, it is really doesn't matter to me. It's more the direct experience that, as people talk about it, whatever cognitive category that it could be placed in is secondary.
I've been doing a little research on Dark Night of the Soul recently, because I've gone through some stuff in the past couple of years that is just like what you're saying makes so much sense about exposing the cracks, exposing the places where it's like, what am I thinking of? There's some sort of, I believe they're Japanese bowls, and when they get cracks in them, they paint them with gold, and they expose those cracks and highlight them instead of trying to paint over it and pretend that they're not there. So that's kind of what I'm hearing you say.
Yeah. Well, to paraphrase Leonard Cohen, he said something about that's where the light shines through in the
Yes.
cracks. And
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so there's different metaphors that we can use. They're all, I think, capture a similar idea.
Yeah. That's wonderful.
Yeah, it's those people who may be listening who've gone through trainings with me or with Brad as well. We don't talk about the spiritual piece very much because for me, sometimes simply to name it, even the word spirituality is coupled in so many people's minds,
Mm-hmm.
both
Mm-hmm.
positively or negatively or some kind of combination. So part of what I just want to emphasize is that I'm not asking anybody to believe anything. I'm really the very strong orientation in NARM is to really listen to yourself, listen to your own experience, listen to the deepest experience, in you. And from that place, I see over and over again that as people get progressively more connected to the deepest elements of the small self and the big self, is that whether they use the word spirituality or not, they're describing spiritual kinds of reactions. And just as you probably experienced in your training, one of the gratifying things for me as a teacher is that as people are being vulnerable and working on various trauma elements, and as the teaching is unfolding and so on, there's such a strong heart space that opens up in the groups. Brad has talked to me about this happens in his groups. It happens in my groups. It's like that there's something about this common intention and the experience of being vulnerable and sharing from the heart and not presenting the persona that we've been so identified with. This creates a real dimension for many people. And it's one of the reasons why most people don't feel ready to give the training up after 2, or if they do the third year to even the third year, because I'm doing like a post masterclass in Los Angeles now, because so many people in my masterclass that I finished in
Oh my
Berkeley,
goodness.
they wanted to continue. They said, we don't want to stop here. So now I'm doing a post masterclass. And
Oh
Brad and
wow.
I have talked about building that dimension in, not as a requirement, but again, as so that people are aware of it. I've had this kind of reaction in the past where people said, what's next? We don't want to stop. And I didn't have anything for them. But, that for me is so sweet and such a really a precious part of the work that I do, that that I can experience it directly, how it touches people, but then to have them express it in words makes it even that much more, just that much sweeter for me.
And I resonate completely with how special these trainings are. I've done so many trainings after grad school, and for people to really, really crave that says a lot about the work that you're doing and the work that Brad does and the model itself.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, unless you have anything else, I think it'd be a great place to wrap up here.
Yeah, no, that sounds good, Sarah. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much for joining us on today's episode. If you want to learn more, you can go to the show notes or visit us at www.narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The Transforming Trauma podcast is brought to you by the NARM Training Institute. NARM practitioner trainings for mental health professionals are offered across North America and internationally. We're offering a podcast review giveaway right now. Each week, we're choosing one reviewer to receive a NARM clinical protocol and NARM personality spectrum worksheet. To enter, please submit a review with an Apple Podcast and send a screenshot of your review to transformingtrauma@narmtraining.com. That's it. Winners will be chosen weekly. Thanks as always to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We really look forward to building community and connection with you and changing the world by transforming trauma.